Welcome to Apple Teeny, where Apple drama, gadget takes, and weird internet nonsense share a glass. This episode has everything: App Store review limbo, fake terminal commands, and the possibility that your backup strategy is just vibes. Also, somebody needs to stage an intervention for bad foldable iPhone rumors. The App Store review machine sounds a lot less like a machine right now, and a lot more like a black box with mood swings. Developers who usually expect 1 to 3 days are seeing 6 to 8, and at least one iOS app sat there for 12 days still pending. That's annoying on its own, but the nasty part is the single gatekeeper setup can freeze an entire release pipeline. If you've got shared in-app purchases across Mac and iPhone, a pending iOS review can block a Mac app that's already approved, and it can even stop new versions or test flight builds. Apple offers all these polished launch tools like pre-orders, editorial timing, planned marketing, the whole big debut package, and all of it depends on reviews being at least somewhat predictable. If review timing turns random, those tools go from helpful to almost theatrical. A lot of people still treat Cloud Sync like a backup, and it absolutely is not the same thing. Sync is great until it faithfully syncs your accidental deletion, your corrupted file, or your ransomware disaster straight into every copy you own. A real backup needs version history or point-in-time recovery, and it should still help if you lose access to the service itself because you got hacked, banned, or locked out in some opaque appeal maze. The practical take here is pretty refreshing. The backup you'll actually use beats the perfect backup you never run. If your Time Machine drive hasn't connected in 340 days, that local backup is mostly decorative. A service like Backblaze might be more realistic for a lot of people, even if Time Machine still wins for a full Mac restore. And yes, an Apple-style iPhone backup model for the Mac sounds appealing. Back up the unique stuff, skip the giant re-downloadable stuff, but with today's iCloud pricing and multi-terabyte Macs, that bill would be absurd. The most interesting Apple Watch idea right now might be less watch, not more watch. There's a real opening for a cheaper, screenless fitness and notification device, something aimed at the Fitbit, Whoop Aura crowd without dragging in the cost and battery pain of a bright display, cellular, and full watchOS. Keep the basics people actually care about: fitness tracking, notifications, fall detection, and don't turn it into a tiny hospital strapped to your wrist. Also, the Apple Watch look has been around for a decade now, and for younger buyers it can feel a little stale next to cheap vintage-looking watches that have way more personality. The ultra-proved design variety matters, and Apple probably needs more of that iPod line energy instead of endless tiny revisions. Apple's memory supply situation sounds ugly in the least glamorous but most expensive way possible. Using Chinese memory maker CXMT as leverage against Samsung and SK Hynix only goes so far when export restrictions force older equipment that reportedly needs around 30% more wafer starts for the same output. Meanwhile, there's a report saying Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron have memory capacity effectively sold out into 2027, with customers booking years ahead. That helps explain the wild claim that about $1 billion of A20 Pro chips could be stuck at TSMC waiting for DRAM so they can actually be packaged. On the software side, Liquid Glass is still moving around late in beta, which is fascinating and slightly alarming. Some icons look like Apple is loosening up and treating Liquid Glass more like a visual theme than a one-size-fits-all recipe, which honestly seems healthier. But when things like Safari, Preview, Settings, and even control layouts are still changing this late, it gets a lot harder to guess what release-ready even means. Tiny power user tip that is way more useful than it sounds. Name your password entries like a human who's trying to save their future self. If you've got multiple Apple IDs or multiple AWS logins, calling them something explicit like Apple ID Developer or AWS Root makes autocomplete so much less cursed. This gets extra important with apps like Slack, which seems committed to making identity management feel like performance art. Same email, different passwords across workspaces, weird account relationships, migrations that don't preserve workspace order or sidebar state. It's a mess, and password managers still don't model that complexity very well. Also, clipboard managers are still alive for a reason. Pace gets a lot of love here because it's polished, it syncs, it shows source apps and previews, and the iPhone and iPad keyboard support is the killer feature. Its pinboards also turn into little snippet vaults for saved links and AI prompts, which means your clipboard history is slowly becoming a second brain with very bad naming conventions. One of the best cautionary tales this week was a fake site impersonating OpenAI codecs that nearly tricked someone into running malicious terminal commands. The only reason it failed was that the command had a suspicious base 64-looking tail, which is a great reminder that copying shell commands from the web on pure trust is an insane tradition we've all normalized. There is at least some hope that Apple's newer command execution protections can warn on specific patterns, and it'd be smart if those detection lists could update remotely as scams evolve. And on Siri, I think the fairest take is that Frontier AI has completely changed the comparison set. People use ChatGPT and Claude for research, planning, image questions, multi-step tasks, and then Siri shows up looking underdressed for the assignment. But Siri still has a real lane if Apple sticks to it. Quick, reliable search across your private personal data. The example here was great. Siri finding a broadband renewal date and terms in email fast enough to save a manual hunt. That's useful. The problem is inconsistency, because similar queries can produce different results for different people, and that makes Siri hard to trust and hard to judge. On EV shopping, one underrated takeaway is that car buying services aren't just for hunting down some unicorn trim in another state. They can negotiate and handle the miserable parts of the process, which honestly might be the bigger value. There's also a very believable theory that some dealers resist out-of-state EV sales because they know EVs mean less service revenue later, which is not exactly a flattering incentive structure. And I love the practical luxury car take, that some expensive options are just nonsense. Ventilated seats that basically blow cabin air and make noise, laser headlights limited by US rules and costing around $8,000 to replace. Incredible way to spend money on disappointment. Meanwhile, Google's Pixel 11 line sounds increasingly expensive and increasingly minor, with the especially goofy report that the Pro goes from 16 gigs of RAM down to 12 while costing more. Some creator camera tools do sound genuinely useful, but the overall vibe is that Pixel is still a good software showcase and no longer a clear hardware flex. And finally, the foldable iPhone rumor claiming a US first launch with no price at launch got treated with the amount of skepticism it deserved. It was traced back to a low credibility source, and it's a good reminder that aggregator headlines can turn flimsy or AI-sounding nonsense into a whole fake conversation in about 10 minutes. One last very relatable pain point: old Macs don't always die dramatically, they just become weird. Hot, sluggish, unreliable, kernel_task, eating absurd amounts of memory, mysterious cache behavior, and no clean answer on whether the culprit is hardware, macOS, or accumulated digital barnacles. The recurring regret is simple though. If you can stretch for more RAM earlier, do it, because that's the upgrade people wish they'd made. And if you're waiting for a genuinely different Mac, not just another iterative bump, you are definitely not alone. That's it for this round of Appletini. Back up your files, inspect your terminal commands, and maybe don't plan your whole launch around app review having a good week. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.